All right, welcome to World History. So this video is a little more relaxed than the last one. It's a little more optional as well. You've got an assignment to do, so make sure you do that. But if you're struggling getting the big picture, you just want a little more entertainment, this is where you'll find all the video clips that we'll watch in class, and also I'll cover some of the big concepts. So let's start with geography. Make sure you know where the Yellow River is and the Yangtze River, okay? They're back, they're important, they're rivers. Turns out you like to drink water, and you also like to eat food, and your food likes to drink water, so you're going to need to be near water. This is why all the major civilizations develop around rivers. We have our friend the Tigris and Euphrates, and we have our friend Nile. By the way, Tigris and Euphrates, two rivers. I'm sorry, I should have said friends. Anyway, we have the Indus, we have the Ganges, now we have the Yellow and the Yangtze rivers. So make sure you know where those are. And we'll get to see some video clips both talking about the flooding and the problems that can bring, and then also how they're using it for hydropower. So that's one of the world's biggest projects. Make sure you watch that clip. Let's talk about, as I look through here, what else we're going to cover today. Oh, mandate of heaven. That's a pretty good vocab word. You will hear that even in a modern context, you can sometimes hear that that person's lost the mandate of heaven. And the mandate of heaven basically means that the gods have destined this person to rule. Okay, so the mandate of heaven is, hey, I'm connected to the gods. That's why I can rule. And we've seen that before with Egypt, the pharaoh, quasi-god, quasi-king. Does that make sense? That all of these civilizations, they have certain things in common. And that's one of them. Okay, let's talk about Confucius. So the two things I want you to know from Confucius is ritual propriety and filial piety. Okay, so ritual propriety means rituals matter. And let me give you an example. You're going to get married, you want to have a wedding. You're going to have a birthday, you want to have a cake with candles, okay? There's certain rituals that we do, and Confucius says in order to have a good society, we need to continue these rituals, okay? So rituals matter. That's one of the things he says, okay? The other one is filial piety, and what he would say is the grass bows to the wind. And that just means know your place in society, respect your parents, respect authority, and also realize you can be both the grass or the wind depending upon the situation. So I am a father, but I am also a son. So when I am the son, I am the grass, I bow to the wind. When I am the father, I am the wind. Does that make sense? Okay, and if a society works like that, where you're respecting your authority and respecting the chain of command, then you'll have order and you'll have a good society. This is all according to Confucius, okay? Confucius is also known for a lot of pithy sayings, so you can look at that as well. We'll talk about Lao Tzu. Was he real? Maybe, maybe not. Impossible to know. I want you to know the term Wu Wei, which means effortless action, okay? So, and it's also connected to nature, but effortless action, there was a time last year where the Frisbee went over the fence, and the student was trying to climb over the fence. I said, don't. And I just stayed there, and I waited for about 15 seconds, and the person came out of the house and just threw it to me. I just let the world solve the problems. How would nature solve the problem? Nature's not stressed out all the time, but everything gets done. So we just want to have effortless action, according to Lao Tzu. Okay. This is relatively important. Legalism. Okay, strict laws. I want you to know that because we'll see some other civilizations that enact strict laws. We're going to learn a new word called draconianism when we get to Greece, and you'll hear about you'll hear in modern terms that's draconian. That means that's incredibly strict. And I just want you to see these civilizations, they have themes. There's certain themes, we're going one way, then we go back the other. We're going Lao Tzu and relaxed and Confucius, and then we're going to legalism and we're being very strict, okay? By the way, just from, Confucianism, even though it comes out at this time, it doesn't really become part of the government yet. That's going to happen later, okay? So just know that. We have the Great Wall of China, and we also have the terracotta soldiers. So I'll let the book explain that to you and these video clips, and let's get started.
The mineral-rich soil of the Loess Plateau is incredibly fertile. People have lived here for thousands of years, hollowing their homes out of the soft soil. The caves might lack the glamour of Beijing, but people can survive here. Warm, secure, but best of all, well-fed. As a result of centuries of farming, the landscape has become scarred with thousands of water-worn gullies. But this spectacular erosion has had an unexpected benefit. The streams which drain the gullies carry the fertile yellow soil into the plateau's major river, known to the Han people as the mother of Chinese civilization. This is the Yellow River. Each year, the Yellow River carries billions of tons of sediment from the Loess Plateau eastwards to the crop fields of the Chinese heartland. Historically, the Chinese relationship with the river has been uneasy. Sediment building up on the riverbed has caused the Yellow River to burst its banks periodically, unleashing devastating floods, resulting in millions of deaths. But when tamed with dikes and channels, the river's bounty is legendary. Even today, half of China's wheat comes from the Yellow River floodplain.
From the waters of the Yangtze River in China rises the biggest concrete structure on the planet. The Three Gorges Dam is over 2 kilometers long and 60 stories tall. It has taken 40,000 workers over 17 years to build. When it fully comes online, this one dam will produce over 20,000 megawatts of power, twice as much as all the nuclear power stations in Britain put together. It is the pinnacle of dam engineering. China is one of the fastest growing economies on Earth. To fuel the need of its ever-accelerating industry, the nation needs more power. Much of this will be provided by an enormous dam spanning the mighty Yangtze River in central China, called the Three Gorges Dam. Our cameras have been granted privileged access to capture this amazing feat of engineering in its full glory. Before they could start building the Three Gorges Dam, the Chinese first had to divert the Yangtze River, which is almost 2 kilometers wide, and move over 1 million people from the area about to be flooded. And when they filled the reservoir behind the dam, the huge mass of water actually slowed down the speed of the Earth's rotation by a fraction.
Well, the Three Gorges Dam is the biggest hydroelectric project in the world. This dam used 28 million cubic meters of concrete. Maybe one way to look at it is to say it's a solid pipe of concrete, a meter diameter, right around the world. It's a lot of concrete.
But the Chinese authorities think it's worth the effort, as the Three Gorges Dam will provide clean and cheap electric power to millions of people. British engineer Robin Charlwood has been working on the dam since 2003 and is still impressed by its scale.
We're in one of the three very large powerhouses of the Three Gorges project. In this 700-meter-long room here, you can see 14 of the large turbine generators. Then beyond this one, a kilometer away is the second powerhouse, and then beyond that one is yet another powerhouse, which will be underground in the rock on the far side of the river. Each one of these generators cost about $50 million, to give you an idea of the scale of this project.
Debden Dam had one generator. Three Gorges has 32. Together they produce 5 million times more power than Debden. To drive them, the Chinese have harnessed the power of the mighty Yangtze River. In the reservoir behind the dam, the river now rises up to 60 stories above the riverbed. The water is channeled down gigantic concrete tubes towards the generators. Here, the torrent of water hits the turbines and makes them spin. This motion is in turn transferred to the rotor of the generator. This is fitted with massive magnets, which move past copper coils in the casing to generate electricity. Just one of these machines makes as much electricity as a small nuclear power plant. All 32 generators together produce enough power for 60 million Chinese.
This project is setting a new benchmark in the international hydroelectric industry. It's almost twice the size of the next largest project, Itaipu in Brazil. And of course, it's only the first of a whole series of megadams that are under construction here in China.
The Yangtze River is over 6,000 kilometers long, and in places several kilometers wide, the biggest river in China. It presents enormous logistical challenges to the dam engineers. As the Yangtze rises behind the Three Gorges Dam, it will flood over 150,000 acres of land along its banks. So the Chinese have to relocate over 1 million people from the land behind the dam. Thousands of new houses have to be built for the displaced citizens to live in. Then the engineers can begin to dam the river.
We're standing here among some of the rocks and these precast concrete blocks that were used to create the cofferdams to control the river during the construction of the Three Gorges project. Controlling the river to allow the construction of this huge project was clearly a major undertaking. I mean, the Yangtze River is one of the largest rivers in the world, very fast, very deep. So building these cofferdams and to allow a safe construction was a major operation. The Chinese claimed that this was the largest and most difficult diversion ever undertaken for a hydroelectric project, and you look at the scale of it, they were absolutely right. This was huge.
The engineers begin work on a series of stone cofferdams to block off part of the Yangtze. whilst leaving a channel open for the rest of the river to flow through. They build the first 2 sections of the main dam on the dry riverbed. Then they dump tons of earth into the river, and on top of it build another cofferdam, this time from concrete. With the river held in check behind it, they can finally build the last section of the dam. Then they must remove the cofferdam so that water can flow through the turbines of the main dam.
Having built such substantial cofferdam structures, it's a major challenge how to remove these things. So in the earlier stages, where they were built of very large rocks like this, then that could be handled with big excavator equipment, relatively conventional. But in the final stage, where they had a solid concrete wall to remove, this required some serious innovation.
Unlike the cofferdam in Marej, the Chinese version is too tall to simply leave it in place. So the Chinese engineers build it leaving holes for explosive charges. On the 6th of June 2006, they filled them with 190 tons of dynamite and hold their breath. What has taken months to build takes only seconds to destroy. As the cofferdam crumbles, it unleashes the water stored behind it. It's the final test for the Three Gorges Dam, and it holds. The Three Gorges Dam takes concrete construction to new heights.
You look at it, you can just picture the thickness of the concrete at the base of the dam, the height of it, 180 meters, and it's 2 kilometers long. So it's a colossal amount of concrete.
Three Gorges uses 10 times more concrete than the Hoover Dam, so the engineers have to pull out all the stops to keep their dam cool.
They basically used everything in the book. They cooled the aggregates and the materials, the sands, before they put it into the mix. They added ice. They did everything they could to get the temperature down as low as they could before it started to warm up all by itself. And here, because of the issue of some of the summer weather being especially hot, July and August, they actually went so far as to use a fog spray system to blow effectively a fog blanket over the top of the dam, with the objective of blocking the solar radiation from piling down into the concrete and adding to the heat that was being generated on the inside.
But all these measures to stop concrete from cracking will count for nothing if the dam is built on weak foundations, as civil engineer Ed McCann explains.
While we can make the dam completely impermeable, it's rather harder for us to make the riverbed impermeable. Now, of course, once the water is up behind the dam here, there's a huge pressure pushing it this way. And whilst the dam won't let the water through, the water simply just goes underneath, and that means you haven't got much of a dam. There is a solution to this, and we'll, if John will give me a hand, we'll have a look at it. John, put the blocks, please. What you've got here is basically a pipe network. These are a series of vertical pipes that go down into the riverbed with little holes in the side of them. And we connect them up to a high-pressure pump. Of course, it wouldn't be this, but it would be a big pump. In this pump, what we've got is a watery grout. It's just cement and water. And when that cement and the grout goes hard, it creates an impermeable barrier. Just this time, it's in the soil. So we'll have a go. Here's our high-pressure pump. So if I squeeze that really hard, there we are. And pretty much straight away, you can see the grout coming out and running through the soil and spreading out, which is exactly what we want to see, of course. And you can see in some areas it goes a long way, and in other areas it doesn't get through. That means that the soil is denser and less permeable there. But that's fine, because what you do is you drill more holes down into the areas here, and you squirt more grout in, and you keep going until you've got a continuous curtain underneath the dam. And there we are. So we have our impermeable dam on top of the riverbed, and we've created a concrete dam underneath the riverbed.
To create an impermeable concrete curtain beneath the Three Gorges Dam, engineers drive 100 kilometers of tubing down into the granite bedrock. Then they pump 200,000 cubic meters of grout into the tubes, which is squeezed into the fissures in the rock. As the grout hardens, it turns the leaky rock into a solid waterproof base for their dam. Now the Chinese engineers can be confident that the Yangtze will not undermine their dam.
Basically, the dam holds back a large volume of the water during the flood period. Here it can hold back about 22 billion cubic meters of water. And then it's released in a controlled way through this system of 46 spillway gates and these chutes that you can see below me here. The design of a spillway like this has to deal with the force of the water as it drops over 100 meters in this case here, and then achieves huge velocity at the bottom of the dam.
To deflect the force of the water crashing down, the Chinese use technology similar to the Grand Coulee. As the water levels rise, engineers open a series of gates to drain the floodwater from the reservoir. But if the water fell straight down, it could undermine the foundations of the dam. So the engineers fit the spillway with concrete chutes. Unlike the Grand Coulee ramp, which is underwater, the Three Gorges chutes hurl the water into the air. Once airborne, the water breaks up into small droplets and loses much of its destructive energy. It lands over 100 meters downstream, where it can't do any damage. So now when they open their spillway gates, the Chinese have nothing to worry about. At China's Three Gorges Dam, the engineers also face a major traffic problem. Their dam sits on one of the busiest rivers in Asia.
The Yangtze is a really important waterway for navigation traffic in China, leading all the way from Shanghai, the coast, up to Yichang, all the way to Chongqing. It's been carrying about 18 million tons of freight per year.
Getting about 170 ships a day over a dam that's more than 100 meters high is a tall order for the engineers. Befitting the biggest dam on Earth, the Chinese solve it by building the biggest ship lock on Earth. Ships enter the lock at the bottom of the dam. The gates close, water floods in and lifts the ships up to the next lock. Ships must go through 5 tiers of locks to get to the top, which can take up to 4 hours. This is fine for cargo ships, but for the many passenger boats operating on the Yangtze, it's just too slow.
To provide a more efficient transit opportunity for passenger traffic, they've built this ship lift system here, which will allow boats to go through in about 36 minutes.
Unlike the ship lift at Krasnoyarsk, the one at the Three Gorges will lift ships straight up, like an elevator. And the secret of its success will lie hidden in its concrete walls. The engineers will fit a series of massive counterweights that will do most of the lifting. 16 1,000-ton concrete blocks will be connected by cables to the steel trough that will carry the ship and the water it floats in. As the counterweights drop, they will hoist the trough upwards and lift the ship to the top.
This ship lift here is 113 meters high and can handle vessels up to 3,000 tons. It'll make it the largest in the world and twice the size of the one at Krasnoyarsk. Certainly when you look at the structure now, it's got a ways to go in terms of construction. It won't be finished till 2015, but it's clearly huge. It's another very impressive achievement underway here.
The Three Gorges Dam produces more power than any other, but that's not the main reason it was built.
The Yangtze River is notorious for its really severe flooding. Over the last 2,000 years, there's been about one major flood every 10 years. In 1931, there was a really bad one, killed about 135,000 people, destroyed almost 2 million homes. And so this is the main reason why they've built the Three Gorges Dam, is to control this terrible flooding problem.
The dam blocks the path of the destructive floodwater. The water is stored in its reservoir and is then released in a controlled way. But managing floodwater can also have serious environmental side effects, as recent history has shown. In 1970, Egyptian engineers built the Aswan High Dam across the River Nile to control flooding. But soon, farmers downstream noticed that their harvests are beginning to fail. Their soil becomes so barren that the farmers need millions of tons of fertilizer every year to nourish their crops. Their land has suffered because it has been deprived of floodwater, which carries with it the vital building blocks of life. Chemist Dr. Andrew Shidlow demonstrates.
So we have here our clean rainwater, which has been falling. We're adding to it some good quality topsoil. We then add some animal excrements. We have some snail shells, essentially made of calcium carbonate. Then we have some dried leaves, plant vegetation here, and of course, fish. As the storm proceeds, as the water starts to flow rapidly, all of these ingredients get mashed up in the hugely violent storm waters which occur. So here we have it, a veritable cocktail of Mother Nature's most important plant nutrients: nitrogen, phosphorus, calcium, magnesium, and potassium.
But if floodwater stops flowing, these nutritious particles of silt will begin to settle. This is a big problem, especially at the biggest dam in the world. The flow of precious Yangtze silt is blocked by the dam and trapped in the slow-moving water of the reservoir. It rapidly sinks to the bottom where it builds up.
The silting problem on the Yangtze is a huge problem. The total amount coming down is about 500 million tons per year, which equates to about 1 kilometer cube. Perhaps enough to fill big sports stadiums hundreds of times. It's a huge amount of silt.
If this silt remains trapped behind the dam, it would mean that farmers, fishermen, and wildlife would be deprived of nutrients in the water for hundreds of miles downstream. And the tons of settled silt or sediment could build up in the reservoir and threaten the dam itself.
Basically, sediment falling into the reservoir here would reduce the capacity, the reservoir capacity, and would eventually perhaps interfere with the ability to run the turbines if it came up that high.
Cleverly, the Chinese engineers exploit the power of floodwater to flush the sediment out of the reservoir and send it downstream. They installed sluice gates deep inside the dam. Each gate weighs as much as a bus and needs a powerful hydraulic piston to lift it up. When the operators open the gates, floodwater rushes over the trapped sediment and sweeps it through the dam. This way, the Chinese authorities hope that it will be at least another 100 years before the buildup of sediment affects power production at the dam. But even the clever purging system cannot carry all the sediment across the dam. Scientific estimates on how much sediment remains behind vary from as little as 30% to as much as 60%. But the Chinese authorities believe that this is a price worth paying. They are convinced that the benefits of the dam, such as clean energy and flood control, far outweigh its significant drawbacks. As the Three Gorges project draws to completion, its scale is breathtaking. Even with some of its turbines still to be switched on, it produces more power than any other dam in the world. Standing on the shoulders of historic engineering giants, the Three Gorges really is the ultimate hydroelectric dam. Until someone builds an even bigger one.
We're in the Shanghai Museum and we're looking at a very early oracle bone. And this is so important because this brings us to the very beginnings of writing in ancient China.
The oracle bone is on an ox scapula, so it's actually the shoulder blade here that you can see carved little tiny characters from the right to the left, all in little lines.
And those characters are still, many of them, recognizable as Chinese characters
Yeah, about
today.
40% of them actually are decipherable. And we have tons of these remaining. We have about 200,000 of them.
We're not really used to the idea in the West that we could read writing that's more than 3,000 years old.
And of course, this is really important because you can read history through it. When we have a group of these objects together, we can look back and see how things evolved on this particular year, what kinds of concerns people had.
It's an oracle bone, so we know that it was something that could divine the future, that could help people understand what the future might bring.
They would get these bones, they would inscribe the questions on them, and then a diviner would come and use a particular ritual that involved a heated rod, a metal rod, that they would touch to the bone, and the way that the cracks would evolve on the questions would divine the future.
So the cracks would be read by someone who had a kind of special power.
The questions were all directed toward somebody named Shang Di, the deified ancestor of the Shang royal cult. And when we're talking about the Shang dynasty, this is in the cradle of civilization, the Yellow River Valley, the capital. And the kinds of questions that people would ask would involve everything from the very mundane to ritualistic things. When should a sacrifice be performed, a particular rite of worship? This one, we're looking at a question about the bumper harvest, when to be planting.
And ancestor worship was incredibly important during the Shang dynasty, and that's something that will change with the next dynasty, the Zhou dynasty.
When we get into the Zhou, we see a different concept of the divine.
So Shang Di was the particular ancestor / god of the Shang dynasty,
Exactly.
and of course it makes sense with the next
royal.
dynasty.
Exactly.
You'd have to adjust.
You'd have to adjust.
So we see these especially on scapula of oxen, but also other animal bones and also tortoise shell.
Tortoiseshell is another favorite medium. Probably also this tortoise was an important mythological creature from very early times. But here you can see that the medium itself is very flat. It's a good surface to carve into. Mm-hmm. And when we're looking at these kinds of things, keep in mind that this is what we have. We have bones. These stood the test of time, but that doesn't mean that there wasn't also writing on other things.
And the writing that we're seeing, we know that Chinese characters stand for words, but perhaps at this time in history, the signs that we're seeing are more pictographic until it evolves.
Yeah, they've been slowly decoded, and actually art historians have spent quite a bit of time trying to decipher this, enough so that we can read them. But at this point, writing is a functional medium. It's to communicate, in this example, with the gods. Eventually, it evolves into calligraphy, which becomes this art form.
And so the importance of Chinese writing here in this very early moment.
A lot of major developments in Chinese society, right? We've got centralized power as a major theme coming out of the writing, the idea that people can communicate and organize, and this idea of creating a history here.
And so lucky that we can at least untangle 40% of it, of these thousands of bones that survive.
Exactly.
And one day we'll understand even more of them.
Even more of them, exactly.
Hi and welcome to our new series on Chinese historical figures. Today we're going to be starting off this first episode talking about Confucius. And if you're talking about notable figures in Chinese history, Confucius is a great place to start, because he really is the philosopher who defined Chinese society for the past 2,000 years. Now, Confucius is thought to have lived from 551 to 479 BC, during the so-called Spring and Autumn period, when China's Zhou dynasty was gradually splitting up. Now, this era later turned into the Warring States period before China was unified again in around 200 BC. Confucius was born in the state of Lu. This is in modern-day Shandong province. Now, at the time when Confucius was born, China was kind of like medieval Europe. Different states were competing with each other for power. Confucius saw morality deteriorating and the aristocracy turning their back on the traditions of the Zhou dynasty. Confucius viewed the Zhou as a kind of golden age. Confucius felt he had a mission to return China to its former glory, to return to the Way, or the Tao. Now, today, the Tao refers to China's traditional culture of self-cultivation and emphasis on the way of virtue. Confucius felt that people in his age had lost true respect for the established rituals and norms of society. They merely carried out the formalities without really understanding the true essence. To use the words of the time, the world lacked the Tao. Thus, Confucius started a mission of educating the populace. Confucius taught his disciples to become gentlemen, instructing them in the 6 arts: rites, music, archery, charioteering, calligraphy, and mathematics. Confucius stressed several philosophical concepts that would serve to maintain China's social structure for the next 2 millennia. These include benevolence, righteousness, propriety, wisdom, and faithfulness, as well as loyalty and filial piety, or the respectful relationship between subordinates and their superiors, such as sons and their fathers, or subjects and their rulers. Confucius was never employed in any significant government post during his lifetime. But during the Han Dynasty, almost 300 years after his death, Confucianism was adopted as the state philosophy. Confucianism came to be known as one of China's 3 belief systems, which also included Buddhism and Taoism. But Confucianism is very much a philosophy for those living in society, whereas Buddhism and Taoism stress withdrawing from the world to seek spiritual enlightenment. The Confucian belief that rulers needed to be virtuous led to the establishment of the imperial examination system. These examinations started in the Sui dynasty, which ran from 589 AD until 618 AD. The examinations saw officials selected based on their academic achievements rather than through a hereditary system, as was common in other parts of the world at the same time. Thus, scholars noted that for many centuries, China had the most advanced political system in the world. Gradually, these examinations became more structured through history. They saw prospective officials tested on their understanding and ability to memorize Confucian texts. Their answers during the exams had to demonstrate the well-cultivated thinking of a Confucian gentleman. The exam system ended a few years before the fall of Imperial China in 1911. After the communist takeover in 1949, Confucianism was ruthlessly attacked, especially during the Cultural Revolution and the campaign to smash the Four Olds: old customs, old culture, old habits, and old ideas. Since Confucianism had been at the very core of Chinese society for 2,000 years, the communist regime's attack against Confucianism can really be seen as an attack against the very essence of Chinese culture. But Confucianism has survived, particularly due to the preservation of the customs in Taiwan and by Chinese living overseas. Today, when speaking of traditional Chinese culture, Confucius can be seen as one of the most influential figures from ancient times right up until present day. His teachings at the very heart of China's traditional culture of self-cultivation and emphasis on virtue.
It's difficult to know much for certain about the Chinese philosopher Lao Tzu. Even his name can be a little confusing. It's also sometimes translated as Lao Tzi or Lao Tse. Lao Tzu is said to have been a record keeper in the court of the central Chinese Zhou dynasty in the 6th century BC and an older contemporary of Confucius. He may also have been entirely mythical, much like Homer in Western culture. Lao Tzu is said to have tired of life in the Zhou court as it grew increasingly morally corrupt. So he left and rode on a water buffalo to the western border of the Chinese Empire. Although he was dressed as a farmer, the border official recognized him and asked him to write down his wisdom. According to this legend, what Lao Tzu wrote became the sacred text known as the Tao Te Ching. After writing this piece, Lao Tzu is said to have crossed the border and disappeared from history, perhaps to become a hermit. In reality, the Tao Te Ching is likely to be the compilation of the works of many authors over time. But stories about Lao Tzu and the Tao Te Ching itself passed down through different Chinese philosophical schools for over 2,000 years. Lao Tzu was the leading figure in the spiritual practice we now know as Taoism, which is more than 2,000 years old and still popular today. There are at least 20 million Taoists, and perhaps even 500 million living around the world now, especially in China and Taiwan. They practice meditation, chant scriptures, and worship a variety of gods and goddesses in temples. Taoists also make pilgrimages to 5 sacred mountains in eastern China in order to pray at the temples and absorb spiritual energy from these holy places, which are believed to be governed by immortals. Taoism is deeply intertwined with other branches of thought like Confucianism and Buddhism. There is a story about the 3 great Asian spiritual leaders, Lao Tzu, Confucius, and Buddha. All were meant to have tasted vinegar. Confucius found it sour, much like he found the world full of degenerate people. And Buddha found it bitter, much like he found the world to be full of suffering. But Lao Tzu found the world sweet. This is telling because Lao Tzu's philosophy tends to look at the apparent discord in the world and see an underlying harmony guided by something called the Tao. The Tao Te Ching, which describes the Tao, is somewhat like the Bible. It gives instructions, often vague and generally open to multiple interpretations, on how to live a good life. It discusses the Tao as the way of the world, which is also the path to virtue, happiness, and harmony. The way isn't an inherently confusing or difficult thing, but in order to follow the Tao, we need to go beyond simply reading and thinking about it. Instead, we must learn flowing or effortless action. It's a sort of purposeful acceptance of the way of the Tao and living in harmony with it. This might seem lofty and bizarre, but most of Lao Tzu's suggestions are actually very simple. First, we ought to make more time for stillness. To the mind that is still, Lao Tzu said, the whole universe surrenders. We need to let go of our schedules, worries, and complex thoughts for a while and simply experience the world. We spend so much time rushing from one place to the next in life, but Lao Tzu reminds us, nature does not hurry, yet everything is accomplished.
It's a vast pottery army which is slowly being unearthed from the tomb where it's lain for more than 2,000 years. At one time, when a Chinese ruler
I work in this site for many years, for decades. Yeah. So these warriors are all life-sized, like real soldiers. Also, they have different facial features. You can tell from their hairstyle, their we call headgears, and you can tell their different ranks. The terracotta warriors was found accidentally. One day, a group of farmers dug in well here, and they find some pieces of the pottery. They also find the head of the terracotta warriors, and the archaeological team came to this area and they start to dig. Originally in ancient China, like 3,000 years ago, they believed the afterlife. When the elites died, like king or noble people, they died, and they normally buried their servants with them, so the human sacrifice, and people start criticize the human sacrifice. So they probably use the terracotta figures as a substitute. When we discovered in pit 3, very surprisingly we find well-preserved colors. When we lift one terracotta bodies, so the very bright colors stick on the soil, very bright, red and pink, blue, green. The other colors are natural, like natural, probably mineral or come from some plants, but the purple is chemical from chemical reaction, so that kind of artificial. So these kind of chemical reaction, so only find in China. That's really revolutionary, that kind of technology in 2,000 years ago in Qin time. That was really fascinating part of my archaeological career. I feel I'm lucky. Also, I feel I have a responsibility. That's unique in China and also unique in the world. Even now I walk in, I still feel very impressed.
What happens after death? Is there a restful paradise? An eternal torment? A rebirth? Or maybe just nothingness? Well, one Chinese emperor thought that whatever the hereafter was, he'd better bring an army. We know that because in 1974, farmers digging a well near their small village stumbled upon one of the most important finds in archaeological history: vast underground chambers surrounding that emperor's tomb and containing more than 8,000 life-size clay soldiers ready for battle. The story of this subterranean army begins with Ying Zheng, who came to power as the king of the Qin state at the age of 13 in 246 BCE. Ambitious and ruthless, he would go on to become Qin Shi Huangdi, the first emperor of China, after uniting its 7 warring kingdoms. His 36-year reign saw many historic accomplishments, including a universal system of weights and measures, a single standardized writing script for all of China, and a defensive barrier that would later come to be known as the Great Wall. But perhaps Qin Shi Huang dedicated so much effort to securing his historical legacy because he was obsessed with his mortality. He spent his last years desperately employing alchemists and deploying expeditions in search of elixirs of life that would help him achieve immortality. And as early as the first year of his reign, he began the construction of a massive underground necropolis filled with monuments, artifacts, and an army to accompany him into the next world and continue his rule. This magnificent army is still standing in precise battle formation and is split across several pits. One contains a main force of 6,000 soldiers, each weighing several hundred pounds. A second has more than 130 war chariots and over 600 horses. And a third houses the high command. An empty fourth pit suggests that the grand project could not be finished before the emperor's death. In addition, nearby chambers contain figures of musicians and acrobats, workers and government officials, and various exotic animals, indicating that Emperor Qin had more plans for the afterlife than simply waging war. All the figurines are sculpted from terracotta, or baked earth, a type of reddish-brown clay. To construct them, multiple workshops and reportedly over 720,000 laborers were commandeered by the emperor, including groups of artisans who molded each body part separately to construct statues as individual as the real warriors in the emperor's army. They stand according to rank and feature different weapons and uniforms, distinct hairstyles and expressions, and even unique ears. Originally, each warrior was painted in bright colors, but their exposure to air caused the paint to dry and flake, leaving only the terracotta base. It is for this very reason that another chamber less than a mile away has not been excavated. This is the actual tomb of Qin Shi Huangdi, reported to contain palaces, precious stones and artifacts, and even rivers of mercury flowing through mountains of bronze. But until a way can be found to expose it without damaging the treasures inside, the tomb remains sealed. Emperor Qin was not alone in wanting company for his final destination. Ancient Egyptian tombs contain clay models representing the ideal afterlife. The dead of Japan's Kofun period were buried with sculptures of horses and houses, and the graves of the Jana Island off the Mexican coast are full of ceramic figurines. Fortunately, as ruthless as he was, Emperor Qin chose to have servants and soldiers built for this purpose, rather than sacrificing living ones to accompany him, as had been practiced in Egypt, West Africa, Anatolia, parts of North America, and even China during the previous Shang and Zhou dynasties. And today, people travel from all over the world to see these stoic soldiers, silently awaiting their battle orders for centuries to come.